Great, thank you. Tough act to follow. So I'm Mark. I am the co-founder and CEO of Sir Kensington's. Thank you all for making it, and thank you to our guests for making the time. I know it's a very busy week for everyone. So we're just going to speak for a little bit and then introduce the main act. So in 2010, Scott and I started Sir Kensington's to really bring our love of food to life. You know, we were so excited by all the change we were seeing in food, you know, the move towards better ingredients, better sourcing, better transparency, but we felt like condiments were getting left behind, and so we decided to do something about it. In 2015, 5 years later, we realized that what was motivating us and driving us as individuals and also as a team went beyond just that love of food. We really felt like food was this incredibly important force in people's lives, and that we had an opportunity, but really a responsibility to focus on more than just building our business and focusing on just our team. And so that's when we put pen to paper on a set of mission and a set of values that represented the drive that really drove all of us towards doing more than just making condiments. And so from that work, a mission emerged, which was to bring integrity and charm to ordinary and overlooked food. So that mission has driven us for the past many years. In the past 3 years, I'm very proud to also say that the values that we developed have really been put to work and put into action. One of those values is that if it's not food, it doesn't belong in our food. And so everything we make from real food. So we thoughtfully source real ingredients in a way that minimizes our environmental impact and maximizes the flavor of what we make. Another very important value is people are our secret ingredient. And for us to really do that, what we aim to do is show respect and to honor everyone who's involved in the Sir Kensington's journey, whether they're in the office or outside. And so we've done things like actually move away from partners who we found to be to have issues of sexual harassment in their workplace. We've banned buying certain products and services from companies we've discovered don't share our fundamental respect for human rights. And over the past couple of years, one of the most important decisions we've made using our values is choosing to be acquired by Unilever. So for those who don't know this, Paul is my new boss, and he's probably expecting this to be very civil, and I can only promise that I will be civil. I don't know what happens. I can't speak for what's happening later, but I can say that we're here today because we felt that there's a shared belief in these values between Sir Kensington's and Unilever. And we're very proud, you know, a year and a half on to be living that. But, you know, voting with our dollars and acting in accordance with our values is only one piece of the equation, and it's not really enough. The world of food, much like any world in the economy, is responsible for equal parts joy and sorrow, depending on where you are in the world of food. The food sector is the US's largest employer, employing 1 out of 7 adults. It's also the worst paying employer in the country, paying a median hourly wage of only $10 an hour. 80% of those workers don't have a single day of paid sick leave, and 60% of them have no health insurance. And so knowing these things, we knew that we needed to keep evolving. So where once we just had condiments, and then we developed a mission, we knew that that mission had to go further. So we took time to write a purpose that we'd be proud of, a much broader purpose. And so from that evolved this belief that food is the most powerful human connector. And to protect that superpower of food, we have to work to defend the dignity of food. And so we aim to do that by creating economic opportunity for those that aren't on the joyful part of the food world. And so we do that, but of course, in our office, but outside of our office with our supply chain partners, and we're aiming to do it all the way down to the people who work in the restaurants that we sell our products to, the hotels that we work with, and the farms that we source from. And so there's a lot of work to be done there, and becoming a B Corp, which is sort of what this is, this event was inspired by, is just one step in that journey. And a B Corp is a company that has both a legal and ethical encouragement to focus on not just financial returns, but also returns for all stakeholders, whether it's community, environment, or your financial shareholders. And so that's just a bit of what we're doing to further achieve our purpose, but we're still at the very beginning. And so to talk a little bit more about what is B Corp, why are we all here, what's this event today, I'll introduce Scott, my co-founder at Sir Kensington's.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah. And thank you, everyone, so much for lending us your time today and lending us your attention. I know that, on any other Thursday afternoon, you'd be hard at work churning through your emails, but this one in particular, we have democracy in process on any television that you can dial into. But we're really thankful that you're here today and lending your time. I'm going to talk about some of the things that Mark alluded to. Sir Kensington's has really always had curiosity in our DNA, right, as people and as a company. And we're obsessed with asking why, right? We are obsessed with this idea of living an examined life. And we examine what we make, right? We re-examine food. But we also examine and re-examine how we make what we make, which is really with the tools of business, right? That is actually how we make food and we get it out into the world. And as he alluded to, we set out to start a company and to grow a company that was valuable to society, and that was behaving in line with our values. And when you think about company value, right, there's obvious financial metrics, right, when you think about value to shareholders, whether it's looking at ratios or dividend yield or certain reports or return on capital. There's hundreds of years of measurement of what makes a business valuable financially. But what about to society? And what about to stakeholders and shareholders and all the other people that a business touches? Well, that's actually what led us to what you see on the wall behind you, which is the B Corp community. And what the B Impact Assessment is, which is the first step in the certification process, is really a scorecard for how you're making an impact, positive or negative, on the world around you outside of your shareholders. And that was a long process, very detailed, where we could actually understand and educate ourselves on our business and the impact that it was having. And it was a tremendously revealing exercise that I encourage anyone who's running a business or is leading a business or has the information to complete the assessment to do so. I guarantee you'll learn something, and I guarantee you'll get new perspective. And it wasn't just this test, right? This thing that we had to click through, hundreds of buttons and hundreds of spreadsheet cells to figure out what was our contribution to society. That was the quantitative element, but really it was the community itself and the mentors that we had, the people from companies like Patagonia and from Ben & Jerry's and Seventh Generation that actually helped us think about what could our particular contribution be and what should our responsibility be. And it was this assessment in this community that now helps us think about the journey that we have ahead of us and the pathway to actually improving that impact and minimizing any negative impact. And so, this announcement, right, it's not to say that we've achieved this certification and so we're a good company, right? It's actually quite the opposite. It's an invitation to the beginning of a trailhead to making improvement and to entering into a conversation of what is the responsibility of a company in society. And so rather than making this proclamation and saying that we've now moved into goodness, instead we actually invite you into this conversation because we want to put your heads where our heads are at, which is really about examining what does it mean to be a good company. And in this conversation, Sir Kensington's is more of a listener than a speaker. And that's why I'm so excited to host the conversation that we have today. We've got some very interesting people that we're going to bring up and be in conversation. We have Paul, who's a tremendously respected leader, a purpose-driven leader that has been a lodestar for our company. And we have Anand, who is to conscious capitalism what Morpheus was to the Matrix. and I'm really excited to introduce and to invite Heather Landy to be the perfect person to actually moderate this conversation. So Heather is the editor of Quartz At Work, which is the Quartz edition around leadership, around the workplace, around governance, and how all those things in the contemporary rub up against ethics and morality. Before Quartz, she was the editor-in-chief of American Banker. She was the special correspondent for the Washington Post in the 2008 financial crisis. She was a reporter at Bloomberg. She's a professor of journalism at the university level, and she's the recipient of the Gerald Loeb Award, which is the highest honor in business journalism. So please join me in inviting Heather Landy, our moderator for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Scott, for that lovely introduction. And as Scott indicated, we know you all have your choice in compelling programming today, so we really appreciate you choosing ours. I was really excited to be asked by Scott and the team at Sir Kensington's to moderate this event because conscious capitalism and corporate social responsibility are topics that I've been thinking about for a very long time. And as a business journalist of a certain age, I have seen a marked evolution in the way that companies, or even if companies, are choosing to approach social responsibility and sustainability. So whether that is Apple signing and dozens of other companies signing an amicus brief in the Supreme Court case that led to the legalization of gay marriage in the United States, or Walmart publicly crowing about the fact that they had lobbied the governor of Arkansas to please veto a state bill that would have protected small business people from selling products and services to people they didn't want to on the basis of religious freedom. Or JP Morgan Chase explaining just this week, their CEO Jamie Dimon was explaining that he was opening 50 new bank branches in the Philadelphia area, and when he was asked why, he talked not about the maximization of shareholder value or the fortress balance sheet. He talked about philanthropy and affordable housing and JP Morgan's program for assisting young Black entrepreneurs. This is a different world, and it is not without its controversies. And so I'm really glad that we have the guests today that we have to help walk us through everything that's at stake here. So first, we'll welcome Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever since 2009. Paul had a long career at Procter & Gamble and a stop at Nestle as the CFO before he came to Unilever. He's the chairman of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He's involved with the World Economic Forum, the folks who bring you the Davos conference every year, and he is on the board of the UN Global Compact. Sustainability and social responsibility are not just extracurriculars for him, though. He has made these things pillars of his strategy at Unilever. Anand Giridharadas is an award-winning author and political analyst and a former New York Times correspondent. He is a Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute, an association that actually helped lead up to the book that was just released from him, his latest book called Winners Take All. It is an eye-opening argument against a kind of giving back that refuses to acknowledge what givers also take. That atomizes the world's problems so that they can be easily fitted with Band-Aids, but refuses to ask the questions about systemic inequities that benefit the people in power, the people with money, at the expense of the people who the powered and the moneyed are now supposedly so interested in helping. I'm happy to tell you that everyone here in our audience today will be getting a copy of the book, so thank you for that, Anand. So please join us. So there will be a lot to debate today, I'm certain, but before we do, I think it might be useful to first maybe establish some common ground between the two of you. So for example, a few things off the top of my head, you've both spent a lot of time in Ohio. So Anand in Cleveland, where he was born and raised, and Paul in Cincinnati when he was an executive for Procter & Gamble. You're both fathers. Paul was at one time, as I understand it, seriously interested in joining the priesthood. And Anand, as I've heard it, you were inspired, at least in part, to write this book by the Pope, and once officiated a friend's wedding.
Find any kind of spiritual connection to me, but you did a good job.
Thank you.
You meant the Pope got inspired by his book.
that might happen too, but and once officiated a friend's wedding, or so I heard. So, but also on a more serious note, I think you would both agree that there are a lot of structural problems around the world that desperately need tending to. the question might just be who's best to tend to them and in what way. Paul, so I'd like to start with you. If you can maybe lay out for us the problems that you see around the world, the big concerns that led you to make sustainability and social responsibility a part of your business strategy.
So first of all, thanks for the opportunity, and to Scott and Mark, congratulations with the celebration, because that's why we're here, to be a B Corp. When I just met Anand for the first time and we were sitting here going into the meeting, we already started to disagree. You know, normally you're on a panel and you have opposing views. In fact, in a lot of things that are in his book, and certainly the things that I've picked up of what he's doing, I think there's more agreement than disagreement. But our first argument was, who is sitting on the left of whom? I'm happy to announce that I actually ended up sitting on the left of Anand.
But we'll move.
But we will move
Depending on
according,
what
exactly.
You can vote.
So we both met in Ohio. I always like to say last week we had the California Climate Summit that Jerry Brown and Mike Bloomberg pulled together. A very successful summit, by the way, in many respects, although the ambitions need to go higher. But the comment I made there is I'm glad that I moved from Ohio to California for different reasons, because Ohio for me stands for your own house in order, which might be what a lot of companies do. But what we need is California, which stands for collective action. So that's probably a more important state right now, in the US at least, for moving things forward. The state of the world is not easy to explain in 2 minutes, but there is a clear thing happening that people have discovered, probably more so after the financial crisis, that there is no doubt that in the last few decades we have lifted more people out of poverty by the normal statistics than anything else. Kofi Annan, who we are commemorating this week at the UN, started the Millennial Development Goals in 2000 that are now the Sustainable Development Goals for the next 15 years. And that was a simple objective, to halve the number of people living in poverty, and that was defined as $1.25 a day. And lo and behold, we have achieved that. I think the financial crisis pointed out, though, that the way in which we were doing this perhaps is not really a very sustainable way. High levels of government debt or private debt, overconsumption, and frankly, what Anand would argue in his book as well, leaving too many people behind. So what I've always said was, was not really a financial crisis that became a political crisis or an economic crisis. At the end, what we were dealing here with was a crisis of morality. And that is what we need to solve. Now, it's not so easy, because our economic system needs to quite drastically change to make this more inclusive. And why we're here is for the Sustainable Development Goals, which basically has as an objective to not leave anybody behind, or as I always say, to irreversibly eradicate poverty. And the word irreversibly is important here as well. And now we've discovered to do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. The challenge is quite big, and that is why you see so much confusion. An average, the symptoms of confusion is an average length of a publicly traded company in the US has now dropped down to 17 years. Used to be 67 years when I was born. The average tenure of a CEO is 4.5 years. So we don't have the people equipped to deal with it, and we don't have the organizations that understand what really their role in society should be. What are the challenges, to get to your question? Yes, we do need to decarbonize the global economy. Climate change is the biggest burden, actually is pushing, as we talk, more people into poverty. So we've never decarbonized the global economy. We are carbon junkies, don't know how to do it differently. Secondly, we have this linear consumption pattern. We just dig in the ground, we produce, and then we dump it. Increasingly, we're dumping it in the oceans because we can't find enough space on land. We have more plastic in the oceans than fish before we know it in the next 30 years or so. So we need to move to a circular economy instead of a linear economy, and we have never done that. Then we need to find the space to do this. We've pumped so much money into the global economy. There's actually far more money outside of the real economy than in the real economy, which is chasing returns like you wouldn't believe it. We have $12 trillion in this world on zero or negative interest rates still as we talk. And shorter and shorter and shorter term is the disease. So how do we move the financial markets to the longer term would be the third challenge. And the fourth challenge, for the interest of time, is our economic system rewards capital. There's no question about it. You get now the top 6 or 8 people having the same wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion. Last year's wealth creation, 84% of that wealth creation globally went only to the top 1%. So the system is working for the capital market, but the system isn't working for the labor market, if I put it this way for simplicity. So how do you create a system that is a more inclusive in growth? Now, what he would argue is we have governments, we have institutions, we have democracy, but probably these things aren't working right now either. We're on a deep point in humanity where the global institutions that have been designed in 44 at the time of Bretton Woods to deal with some global challenges are failing us to a great extent at the time where we have more global issues to deal with, which would be like from cybersecurity to climate change to financial markets, and I could go on. So there isn't a global governance mechanism to deal with these interdependent issues at the scale that we need them right now. So what I argue for is not business there or governments here or NGOs there. I just argue from if we really want to snap out of this, we need to get to a higher moral level of operating that frankly requires the best of all of us. I'm not here to say this one is a good pocket or a bad pocket or a good actor or a bad actor. We're trying to galvanize at scale using the size and scale of this company to drive these more transformative changes that society needs right now. That's why I think in essence we probably have more common ground, although the how might be easier to talk about than the what, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
Paul mentioned the need for a higher moral operating system from companies. Are people in business capable of having a higher moral operating system than we've seen to date?
Sure, but I think I agreed with a lot of what you said. I mean, I think I literally wrote this is 80 to 1. I was literally going to cite the same statistic you did, which I think is really one of the most important numbers of our time, that 80-some% of new wealth created last year, we're not talking about the last 50 years, in this very era in which we're all so conscious. 80% of new wealth last year went to the top 1%. So we are digging the problem deeper and deeper actively, right? And so I come to this from a very different perspective, which is I am, on one hand, amazed by the number of people who talk in the language you do, the number of companies, as you said, who speak in a language of giving back, the number of B Corps there are, shifting a little bit, the number of billionaires who've signed the Giving Pledge, the number of, shifting again, the number of, when I go to campuses, it's hard to find a 21-year-old on the verge of graduation who is not trying to figure out how to change the world next year, right? And I often say, like half tongue in cheek, like every kid is planning to start like a social enterprise that will turn recycled poop into coffee or something and sell it in Africa, and then it'll become a tote bag, and it's the whole thing. And
it's called the circular economy.
It's so circular, and the coffee is quite earthy, a little funk to it, and so on one hand, and I could go on with the examples, but you all get the idea. You can't go shopping. I'm sorry to leave all of you behind. You can't go shopping these days without just being presented with all these products that are going to change the world if you merely buy them. And that is all great. Everything I just said is great, and everything that people like you are doing is great. But just to simplify, if the number is still true, that still, despite all these efforts, 84% of new wealth last year went to the top 1%, then all of those efforts, which have been now had quite a few years to prove themselves, I think are not, they're moving certain needles, and they're changing how companies talk and think and operate, and they're making some people's lives better. But that number that you said is kind of a staggering open and shut case, that it is not arresting the development that essentially allows the winners of our age to monopolize progress, right? That number, like, kind of overrules efforts. Everything else is an input variable. That's the output variable. And so I became and that's not the only number we could talk about. You're right about the world, and poverty reduction. A lot of that was two countries that had very bad systems for a long period of time and basically revoked their mistakes. And I think those are very specific historical cases.
But there's always a country that does better than others, but that's the facts.
But I focused my book on the United States, where a lot of this elite do-gooding takes root, where more of the billionaires are than most places. And the fact that we live in this age of extraordinary elite generosity that happens to be the worst time to be an average person in this country in 100 years, the period of peak inequality in 100 years, the period in which we had this financial crisis that was caused by, we know exactly who caused it, and those people and their friends were literally the only people who recovered from it. So that the average American is still 30% poorer than in 2007, right? I have lost hope in the idea that elites voluntarily doing good is going to do much against that kind of 84% number. It's going to do much against the kind of fact that the people who caused the financial crisis monopolized the recovery. I think when you're talking about those kind of issues, you are talking, and this may sound hyperbolic, but I really don't think it is. You're talking about not an economy that's out of whack or out of tune. You're talking about ongoing crimes that are being committed. You're talking about systemic crimes, that the design of societies in ways that will, if you just run the scenario a million times, will always mean the bankers recover from the crisis and people don't. Will always mean that 84% of people benefit from that new wealth. 84% of that wealth goes to the top 1%. Will always mean that the people in Greenwich and Marin and Westchester go to better public schools than everybody else. And so I think one way that I would ask you all to think about the question of, can business do this voluntarily, and is that enough? I think this becomes clear if you think of any historical examples. Okay, so let's take two. Let's take, you go back some number of decades, I mean, given what we're talking about today in the news, let's talk about sexual harassment and the state of women, let's say 30 or 40 years ago. I don't know when that term quite, but 30, 40 years ago, when it would have been totally normal and people kind of expected this stuff around the office, right? And then we started doing laws. Or let's talk about racial segregation in restaurants where you couldn't come in, or separate counters. I think if we were, any of us now, looking back on those cases, were to say what would be the right thing to do, I think we would all agree that some restaurant owners, some white restaurant owners in Birmingham, saying, you know what, I don't hate black people. I'm going to do my restaurant. I'm going to desegregate my restaurant. Anybody can come here. And I'm sure, by the way, there were some of those restaurants. Right? I think we would all agree, no, that was not the answer to the problem in Birmingham. Wonderful that there were some restaurants that didn't hate black people. But I think looking back, we would all say, that's a Band-Aid on a cancer. And it actually might distract you from solving the real problem. It almost to solve it that way by saying, well, these two restaurants that have no problem with black people would mischaracterize, misdiagnose, would almost change how we think about the problem. And I think similarly, if you think of sexual harassment, I think proving the presence of some men, 20%, 30%, 40% of men in a company or in an industry who signed some pledge, who stopped harassing women, I think we'd all agree, not good enough. Even if it was enforced, and even if those 40% of men really didn't do it, even if 80% of men stopped doing it, even if 95%, as we now know, 5% of men can cause a lot of problems. And I'm not saying it's 5% of men, but it doesn't take a lot of men to make entire environments toxic. And I think we would all agree, looking back on, right? I think we'd all agree in that situation that men voluntarily being better, having some certification to be better, no. Change the law, change the system, change it for everybody at the root. And I am not saying that every problem is that kind of problem. But I think many of the problems you talked about that I'm talking about, when you talk about that wealth going to the top, when you talk about the financial crisis, when you talk about extreme inequality, I think those problems are going to be looked back on 30, 40 years from now, the way we look at segregation and sexual harassment in 1970. And I think those of us who were advocates for an approach that emphasized individual voluntary stepping up may not look as good as we think in retrospect.
Yeah, so I actually don't disagree with that. I just would add a few things, if I may. I don't think we talk here involuntary. I think we need, as I said, we need the involvement of everybody to change at the magnitude that we need to change. I don't think there's a difference between people. First of all, I don't think, and you live in this country, I don't live here. Unfortunately, there aren't as many people talking it and actually living it. That's the problem. And actually, I don't even think there are as many people talking it. So, and your book is a good contribution of raising the awareness, but it's also talking. Your book is talking on paper, but it's raising the awareness. What we now need to do is rise above that at a little bit of a higher moral level to get to these actions. It would be for me unacceptable to sit here and say, and we're going to be defeatists, that when in 15, 20 or 30 years from now, we would be in a situation like we are still in this country as far as racial issues are concerned. That would be for me unacceptable. So what we need is not to say, few philanthropists are not going to solve it. I would agree with that. That would also be too simple to say it like that. Or a few businesses alone can't do it. We see right now the bulk of society not functioning the way we want it, but we see the emergence of enough people from different parts of society that are willing to get together on a higher level of trust to drive these systems changes that are needed. So do we get enough people to work on the system than in the system is really the challenge that you give us. And that's a fair challenge. I would not disagree with any of that. What I'm focused on is much more is if you are then in a position like this, look at the influence of a pope, of what he made. Or look at some of the governments, the Nordic governments that are more responsible in driving systems change than some others. And we're one of these Nordic countries. Or you still can find in the business community some people that are willing to go beyond their self-interest. You call it win-lose. I don't think it has to be win-lose, but it has to be beyond your self-interest to drive change. Can we work the system in such a way that we get enough tipping points, if you want to call it that way, to drive these system changes? The best way to do that is to work all together. So one of the things that we like to do in Unilever as a company is try to see if we can create movements. And what I found is that the best success right now that we see across the world in some of these things is if you empower the people themselves to be these drivers of change. When your Parkland school disaster happened, disaster number 150,000 plus in this country, which always is mind-boggling to us where we live in other countries. And you see the students themselves stand up and say, who saw their own classmates being mowed down in front of you, the NRA, enough is enough, or we need to change some of the things. It was them who made companies in this country change, not the countries themselves, not the companies themselves. So can you nurture on some of these major changes that are needed enough of the people in this world, enough of the young people especially, to start to drive these changes? The climate change agreement in Paris, which by no means is enough, which we have a lot of work to do, but we bent the curve because young people went into the streets. And then increasingly companies saw their interests and started to join, and increasingly we see governments join. But this is a great example where governments have to be lifted up to the level of ambition that is needed. So, not by choice, because it wasn't my choice, it could have been a lot of other people, but a person like myself or many others here end up being in a company like this and leading a company like this, then it is our duty, the way we see it, to put ourselves to the service of society, to work that. So we create space, we stop quarterly reporting, we reward people differently, we decouple our business model from environmental footprint, we look at social impact. Even at the very fine line that we walk, that some of the financial hawks who are more interested in the billionaires than in serving the billions might nearly even take over your company. That's the fine line of reality that we are in. But what we are seeing in reality is that we can increasingly, around some of these things, create these tipping points. I certainly couldn't do it alone. Our company can't do it alone. But these movements are starting to happen if they are all inclusive. So I think the dimension that could be the next step in your book or in your follow-up on your book is that it's not just these billionaires who don't move, because yes, that wealth creation has been obscene, to be honest, in a very short period of time for a few people. That to me is not where the problem is, nor the solution is. The solution is how do we create these partnerships across all these different parts of society to attack these real issues that need to be attacked.
I think to get a little more specific, I hear that, but my book's not only about the billionaires and their giving. It's also about, to my mind, business often being on both sides of the issue of justice and fighting on both sides of the war, right? I'm going to show you this thing, which I know will be meaningful to you. This is an ad that's very famous. I want to give you a chance to make history right now. Do you know this ad? This is an ad for a product called Fair and Lovely, right? This woman, in the terms of the ad, is too dark. And she's a disappointment to her father, who's crying because he can't marry her off. And she can't get a job because she's dark, but then she finds this air hostess job, and she looks at herself. And then with no one looking, she gets Fair and Lovely, Unilever product, and she lightens herself. So you look at and she lightens her skin. The darkness of being Indian comes off. It vanishes. And look at that. Miraculously, she's lighter. Look at those shades of lightness. She's now lighter. She becomes an air hostess. And because of that, she's able to take her father out to dinner, and he's amazed that she has money, and his life is suddenly redeemed. He was also anguished that he didn't have a son at the beginning of the ad, right? It's a big business for you guys, right? And I will tell you, as someone who is Indian, I'm sure if I was from a different background, there'd be a different story. The number of women in my life I'm related to, who I've loved and been friends with, who've cried because of this product, who've been given this product by a relative with a strong suggestion that if you don't get lighter, we're never going to be able to marry you off. I'm not saying that Unilever or this product created the skin color preference in India, but any thoughtful person operating in that market, or even not, knows that that's an awful thing in India that exists. It exists in the Middle East. It exists in, I was talking to a friend in Egypt today who said this is a big problem in Egypt. And many women there, have been made to feel awful about themselves because of this product. And so I was thinking about, what does it mean? I love the messages of companies doing all this good stuff. But what does it mean to, there's a Fair and Lovely foundation, right? And part of me wants to live in a world in which there's no Fair and Lovely foundation because there's also no Fair and Lovely.
No.
And that would mean, and so here's my invitation to you, because I know you know the criticisms of the product. It's probably not the first time you've heard it. No. Would you be willing today, the global board is 2/3 white of Unilever, and there's something unseemly to me, and this is where it gets beyond billionaires. A company that is led by 2/3 white people.
Yeah, which isn't quite true, but that's okay.
I counted it yesterday.
Matter for the argument.
Right.
Our board is very well balanced with women.
It's majority, but it's majority white.
I
checked it.
It's not. No, it's not.
Well, we can talk about that later. But a company that has a white leadership in many parts of the world is selling a product in brown parts of the world that explicitly in advertising say it's not good to be dark, and if you pay for our product, you get lighter. Would you here be willing to condemn this product and say you want to commit to removing it from your lineup?
So first, just for the record, my board has 2 Chinese, a Korean, 2 Africans, and we have 12 people on the board. So statistically, just get that is important for me. It's also half women, half men. That's important.
I checked on your website.
No, that's important too. We have to update the website then. So in terms of products here, I think you're raising a broader issue, and I do agree that.
No, but I want can we focus on Fair and Lovely for a second?
No, we can focus on anything. That's why I'm getting to it. The issue of Fair and Lovely, do you sell or do you not sell Fair and Lovely, is an issue that you could argue the way you're doing that for the whole cosmetics industry. For anybody who buys any cosmetic, why do you need to put lipstick on type argument and have your own opinion? I have my opinions that why should people drive a big fancy car and a Rolls Royce when we can get around in a simple Morris Mini? So 1 second, you have to let me just finish it. So for each of these products, we might have our opinions. And there are products that I find less useful than others. And other people might have different opinions about it. Certainly some products have been created for needs that were not needed. I also agree with that. But there is just a little bit of a bigger issue out here, that the world is burning, and we're talking about a micro issue to make a point. We can write a whole book about a few billionaires that are not behaving well, or a company that earns so much money and then does a little foundation or gives back to society. I like to focus on the bigger picture. The bigger picture here really is that if you look at all economies in the world, and I sort of hit 40, 50 countries a year in my life, I have become convinced of one thing, that in markets or in countries where brands and companies can freely compete in a responsible way to meet desired consumer needs, the standards of living seem to be higher. In countries where that isn't the case, the consumers suffer. So I tend to support a system indeed where brands can compete. The reality is that the system in which these brands compete on a macro level is not giving us the results for everybody. So as a company, as a person, I'd like to focus on those things on a macro level. If we start to put our own value judgments on each of these brands, we will not get there. Honestly, the house is burning and you're talking about what faucet shall we install in the kitchen. And Fair & Lovely might be a product that you don't think is of a benefit. We stop selling Fair & Lovely tomorrow, which is not for this discussion, but we could sell Fair & Lovely tomorrow, stop selling it tomorrow, and you know better than I do all these horrible bleaching products that are there in India because it's so embedded in the culture. Then you might sell all your sun care products because there are horrible things in sun care products. In fact, you might stop all the cosmetics companies. But by doing that, you're not solving the underlying issue that we're talking here about of how to make this society more inclusive and how to get into a way of living with planet Earth that guarantees the future now and for generations to come. So I'd like to focus on these bigger issues as these companies themselves transform. It's like saying today, and it's all fine if you make these statements, but you have to have a real connection with the world if you want to drive these changes. It's like saying, all the energy companies should go out of business now because they all burn fossil fuel that kills us 700,000 people a year just on air pollution alone. So I want all the BPs, the Exxons and the Shells tomorrow to stop working. In fact, that product is more devastating to the world right now than any Fair & Lovely in the world. And you know that's not the solution. The solution is to sit with all these companies and say, we need energy in this world, especially the poor people have been deprived on it. How can we create tipping points? How can we move it faster than what we've clearly been able to do today, which is a failure to many aspects, to ensure that we get energy and can live for generations to come. So that's where my energy goes. And I found that that energy is better for my life and that energy is actually better for companies like ours to motivate people to do even more to get to those points. And your final point, which is very important to me, this world is long on words and short on actions. I would challenge you to write your next book on the actions that are needed and on the actions that people would do. Because the analysis is simple, but the actions were lacking. I'm spending the whole week in New York now, and there are many people, many bankers, many others, on panels talking fancy words and fancy things, all starting to mimic the same thing and not getting the results. What I like to live in this space is, and what I like to get people to is, how do we then actually move forward and make it work? And that is the essence of what we're trying to do in Unilever. I think to some extent the essence of what things like the B Corp or the B movement that we have created, or focusing capital on the long term, or now the Food and Land Use Alliance to deal with this burning issue of a broken food system are trying to address. And if we can have more energy in that direction, I think we have a better chance, and I'm wording it carefully, we have a better chance to solve these world's issues versus pointing at these world's issues.
I mean, I'll say a couple things in response. One, business people always tell me, it's so easy to say what the problems are, but where are the solutions? And if that was true, business people would write better books, right? It's actually very hard to diagnose what the problems are. I think in medicine, if you had a doctor that wanted to skip the diagnostic phase and just go to the pill cabinet and throw you something, you'd go to a different doctor. And so I think there's a minimization in the corporate world, just culturally, of diagnosis. So I want to just stand up for the kind of work I do. It's literally every business guy tells me, like, your next book needs to be solutions. James Baldwin didn't need to write a solutions book about white supremacy, right? Betty Friedan, writing The Feminist Mystique, didn't need to write a solutions book. The diagnosis of these, so when we talk about white supremacy or male supremacy, I think, again, it's obvious to us. Diagnosis is useful work. Criticism is useful work.
Agreed.
And I think what we're talking about now, and kind of on the terms you started, is capital supremacy, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think is a kind of supremacy that we actually have not done as good a job of eradicating, and has become worse in our time. And I also want to say, I hear you, and I hear the what about this? It's called, whataboutism. But I think part of why business has lost a lot of trust in our time It's like you are a uniquely, and many people have told me that you're a uniquely moral leader in the business world. You are not the people from Goldman Sachs, in your heart, in your actions, etc. But I think, and I don't know this room, I don't know how you all feel about this, but like, I think it should be easier than it was to say, that is not an ad that any company should run in any country. And I'm sorry for women having to be on the end of that. And yes, it's complicated, and I got to talk to my team, and I can't do that. But I think what is hard is, I find it harder to trust the real things I know that you are doing when it is hard. Any friend of mine who saw that ad, who didn't have a company, was just a normal person, I think maybe if I got you after hours, not here, would say, yeah, that's not a good ad. We shouldn't be doing that. It's tough, it's complicated, here's why. But I don't think what I showed is complicated at the level of, is that right? Yeah, there are other things, but just because there are other things that are bad, like, and so when and you can dismiss me as saying I'm picking on a small issue when they're big issues. First of all, that, I don't know, you know better than me, that product probably targets about 1 billion women around the world if you add up India plus some of these other markets.
We wish, but
Targets, I'm just saying, those ads are operating in territories where women are susceptible to that messaging. You're not just satisfying a need, and you're telling a story to women about, you know, and I have family members who grew up hating themselves because of that cultural message. And the reason I don't think it's, again, you can minimize me as fixing the faucet when we have
No.
But let me, because it is, to me, about the fundamental question of whether companies ruled by profit are ever really going to be able to do the right thing when push comes to shove. And I think right now, seeing you answer it, I know you're a good guy and you're better than like 90% of business, 95% of business guys I meet, but I see the pressure on you. I see it on your face, being torn between what I think you might feel if you were a private citizen and the burdens of being in a company with a lot of people that needs to make money. And that's not a reason. You can decide whether you want to sit here and say, yeah, maybe we should think about not having that product. But to me, it gets to the larger question of, why don't we just do this stuff collectively through law and systems and policy, these big things? Why do we allow it to happen voluntarily? Because I truly believe that when you have the two angels of making the world better and making profit, you are often conflicted in the very way that I kind of saw in your face a conflict.
No, but you are unfortunately oversimplifying the matter by saying here, why don't we just cut the laws so that these things that are bad not happening in the first place? But we still don't have a law on banning plastics or banning plastic straws. It's actually consumers that are calling for it, not governments. Most governments that do half the procurement in this world, there are very few governments that have a sustainable procurement law. That by far more, you throw things in a waste paper basket, just even now when we come out of the meeting, that are causing the problems of an unsustainable consumption pattern. So to be us as individuals, like you are as much as I am, to cast our judgment on people and point out the little flaws that everybody has. If you, in your eyes, call that flaws, I expect that, you have your right to do that, but it's not helping us get to where we want to be. What I'm saying is,
why is
use our collective, because if you say the same thing, my judgment is on this brand or on this company or on this person, I could do the same on anything. I could say on an individual basis, this person behaves like this or this, he shouldn't be around. Just like a company behaves like this or this shouldn't be around. Just like a government says this or this shouldn't be around. That's all fine and well, but why not use that energy to say, why don't we get the right people together to drive the system in the way that is actually going to the benefit of many more people? Why not get that energy in that direction instead of continuously pointing out things we don't like? Because if I would live my life with continuously pointing out the things I don't like on a daily, hourly, minutely basis, I'd probably already had jumped off a building. You know, so the UN isn't functioning as an institution. But I do show up in the UN a few days this week to try to see what I can do to constructively help. Companies, I just came out of a meeting with the financial community. There was about $82 trillion of money in the room of people that supposedly have signed up to what is called principles of responsible investment. I can talk to them for half an hour and say, you guys are all jerks because you sign up and you don't do it, and I hate you, and I don't like the banks, and we need to change the system. I'm trying to think of how can we
It's
collectively...
like someone gave you my talk that I gave them.
Okay, no, but it's a great talk then if you give the same. That's why we like each other, and I'm still sitting on the left. But if it's better, what I'm saying is it's better to spend our energy in trying to change these things, because there's one thing missing from the room, that the people that we serve, the people that are left behind, are the people that, and many of them are in your country. These are the people that can't be here, because 1 in 5 still isn't in education. 840 million still go to bed hungry every day. Women are the most discriminated group in this world. I'd rather get my energy towards what do we need to do to lift these people up and make this society work for everybody. Now, you might say these are words, and I love these words, and it's going in the next paragraph in my book, and you look like a basically good guy. I'd rather spend my energy not talking about it and making it happen. And what I feel confident about, increasingly more positive about, not confident, but more positive about, is that there is a group of people, and this is nothing to do with business, that there is a group of people across society that is willing to go together. Some for moral reasons, that's a good thing. Some for pressure. I hear a lot of oil companies now saying, yeah, well, finally I have to say climate change is an issue, I have a price on carbon, because otherwise my kids don't even talk to me anymore. So call that moral pressure or pressure from the use. But increasingly, we have failed in addressing the issues in time, partly because of ignorance perhaps, or not being educated, not seeing it, all coming together at the same time. We failed in our timings. But we are at a point that the cost of not acting on many of these things, if not on all of these things, is now becoming higher than the cost of acting. You know, this is a world where to put a sustainable development agenda together is $3 to $5 trillion a year to convert these systems. It actually can be done. We know what to do. We have the ideas. We don't actually need that much technology, but we need that willpower to do it. But we are just on the conflict prevention and wars that this world is facing right now. We pay 3 or 4 times more than it costs us to implement a better plan. So what I'm saying now to people is, be aware of that. A lot of people don't. Give them the tools to help. Put the coalitions together to make it possible and drive to a better world. What's the other alternative? That's all I'm asking. We can all sit here and say, let's not have this product or that product. Why do we need a Gucci handbag? Why can't it be a cheap bag? Why do we need a bag at all? But that's not solving the issues that we're talking here.
This feels like a good place to steer the conversation to a topic I was
No,
hoping we
he
could-
needs to get at least 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, well,
Which
all
would
right.
also be
Anand.
fair. We're not disagreeing in essence, but I learned from him as well. So.
I mean, I think we're
Give him a
disagreeing,
point.
but...
No, because otherwise you don't sell the book
How
if
many
there's
of you
no
think the issue, I mean, he thinks it's complicated, I think it's fairly simple, like they should get rid of that product. How many of you think it's simple enough that you can say, yeah, they should get rid of that product?
And solve the world's problems for poverty? That's what we're talking
I
about.
never said that.
No, but how many in the room think that
Don't
he should not
caricature
drink
my
with a
point.
plastic
So let me have
straw?
my 2 or 3 minutes. And how many think they shouldn't get rid of that product because then they'd have to get rid of everything and Gucci handbags and whatever?
Those aren't the only 2 options.
That's not easy.
Say it again?
Yeah.
Those aren't the only 2 options.
Right, no, but I'm trying to summarize our positions. Look, I know.
So you see, it's not the issue. You don't
I
get
know
many
you're
hands.
trying to
Yeah.
raise it as this is a small issue, but the reason it's a synecdoche for a much bigger issue is it gets to the question, in my mind, of who should be at the table in these conversations about our biggest problems, right? And the vision you're arguing for is one, I mean, I write about it a lot in the book. It's very similar to Bill Clinton's vision at CGI, which is this idea of partnerships, right? Companies coming forward, people from government coming forward, people from labor coming forward, all solving things through these kind of public-private partnerships. And that, much of what I'm writing about in the book is that idea becoming the dominant theory of how you change the world. Problems are too complicated, they're too interpenetrated, and you're representing that view well. And the reason I'm picking on one thing, it's easier to think about one thing sometimes. But I'm not picking on it because I think you're caricaturing me as like saying that if we got rid of that product, like it would make a bigger change, or why am I picking on this one thing when there's so many bigger problems? Here's why I'm picking on it. To me, the difficulty you have, which I understand, and we haven't, look, my grandfather worked for Unilever his entire career in India, including probably for that product. I think it gets to the question of, to my mind, whether you belong at that table, solving our biggest public problems, right? there's no question you belong at the table solving your business problems. There's no question you belong at industry tables. There's no question that on any number of public policy issues where you may want to weigh in, you have a right to do that, constitutional right or otherwise. But I think one of the discourses that I have tried to critique, and whether or not you may think critique is useless and only solutions are useful, but I think critique is useful.
Yeah, no, that's not what we're saying either.
But I think the idea that of private-public partnerships, one of the things that is sometimes obscured in that is that it gives the winners of capitalism something of a veto over what kinds of initiatives get done and not. Because often in that private-public partnership, the private people's job is to give the money. Right? So other people may be steering it, the government may also be giving some money, but everybody kind of has to be on board for a lot of these projects to go forward. And so what I'm getting at is, if it is very hard on one little issue that I agree is a niche issue for business people to put aside the profit motive and say, yeah, there's clear right and wrong, and sometimes it's going to cost me $1 billion, and I'm willing to take that, then it, to me, reduces the odds that on the big issues you talk about, like climate change or 84% of wealth going to the top 1%, et cetera, that we are going to get business people to be willing to do the very hard things it's going to take to be part of that. And so for me, it raises the question of, like, should we solve as many problems as we are trying to that way?
Anand, I 100% appreciate you raising the questions, because it allows us to be challenged and come with better answers. But under your definition, I have to worry because nobody would come to the table. I've worked with so many governments that treat their people badly or that don't respect human rights, and it happens in all countries, including in this, that violate basic human values. They would not have the right to be at the table under your definition. I work with a lot of people in civil society that are actually having behaviors that would not fit what you're just describing, and they would not be at the table. And I certainly agree. I could easily point out many, if not all, companies where you could also say they should not be at the table. And then we don't have anybody at the table, and we just continue and say, see, I told you, the issue is so fundamental that we can't solve it. I just don't want to live in that world because I think it's useless. I've been involved in many partnerships in the last 10 years because of the opportunities that were given to me as part of this job. And I get encouragement that there are fortunately enough people here that are fathers, that have children, that have grandchildren, that think about the future of this world, not just in one generation, that might think greed is good for some, but they also believe that generosity is better, that have a different partnership principle in terms of common goods and multi-generational, etc., that I put my hope in those people. And some of these people we call out, and we call them the Gandhis, or we call them the Martin Luther Kings, or we call them the Nelson Mandelas. But unfortunately, for all of us, is there are millions actually in the streets, and we don't listen to them, we don't involve them. Getting these people into these processes makes it very quickly a balance where morality takes over from money. In any of these battles, I've seen morality win and not money. And if we don't give these people more space and empower these people to do that, we won't change these systems the way we need to change them. So I don't want to be a defeatist. I want to be part of the solution, that's all I'm saying. And your book is incredibly helpful because it frames an issue that I actually agree with. It makes people think a little bit better into what they could contribute to solve that. But I'd like to put all my energy there because that is where I can make the biggest contribution, including our company. And just to single out one of this and that and cast that judgment is not just the way to get to these solutions. How many of these major partnerships where we have moved things forward to the benefit of these issues that we need to address have you been involved in? How many have I been involved in? My experience is at least that in the ones I'm involved in, which is basically the space I live in right now, that we do have enough people that can help us move that forward. And I'd like to encourage others to get to that level as well. And that's not a naive message of optimism. We are at a point that I think we can be realistically optimistic if we can drive that level of change that I think the millennial generation, etc., is ready to embark on.
I just want to pick up on the point about movements, because I think you brought it up with Parkland, you brought it up again. I think you're right. We live in an age that we're seeing these kind of flickers of movements again. and here we're going, I'm not talking about Unilever specifically, but in the American context, I would say, there is a number of movements that have a lot of popular support to make this country better in various ways. And the primary obstruction to those movements is corporate influence, right? So if you think about why there is no maternity leave in this country, it is not because most people don't want maternity leave. It actually polls much better, and then something happens in Washington where a lot of money is spent, including in the food industry, lobby groups and others that lobby against it and overrule what the movements want. If you think about the new issues with the new power of Silicon Valley and tech, like, why is it that it's been so hard? I mean, we literally had an election compromised. People take elections very seriously in this country. We had an election compromised. Nothing's happened to Facebook. Why? Many people in America would be very happy to have something happen to Facebook or to have antitrust scrutiny on some of these companies, the way you do in Europe, by the way. Why doesn't it happen? Because here, they rig the political process and they give a lot of money. So again, I love the idea, but you're talking about a world in which there's movements, and you keep saying "our" with movements, like companies working with movements. But what I see in my world, in many cases, not all cases, is companies blocking movements.
So I wouldn't disagree with you there. I also see many governments where democracy is being challenged, where people don't have the freedom. There's a direct correlation between the freedom for women and laws that give women the equal rights to education, land rights, or sexual reproduction rights, if you want to, or any of the others, and economic development. Most countries in the world still have governments that feel it's very acceptable to discriminate against women. I see governments that increasingly suppress democracy. So whilst you see these things in your eyes, with there's a business here, there's a business there, I see different parts of society that and people, individuals or NGOs behaving the same way. So that is not where the issue is. The issue is, how do you then bring the right people together to drive the change? Use an example that you used of maternity leave. We in Unilever think it's better to have a very generous maternity leave, which we have made global now, by the way, in many countries where it doesn't exist. You are fortunate in the US in many respects. We've introduced a global policy because we think, what's the difference between an employee in country A, country B, or country C? In fact, we've introduced a paternity leave because we think the husband is as important. In fact, we're paying for sex change operations because we think that's important. Now, why do we do that? Because we want to have everybody work with the same dignity, respect. We want to be able to attract the best and brightest. And we arrive at getting 2 million people applying to us every year. Then the company is successful because you get the best people. Everybody's fighting for people. All of a sudden you see other companies that want to come in. You create coalitions and you change governments. We literally have changed governments' maternity policy. We are working with a pension now with the Vietnamese who don't have a pension policy, because it's in our interest to drive these things higher. Otherwise you have the free riders. But you have to start somewhere with companies or people that are willing to create these coalitions and a movement to drive change. I'm working right now with 3 or 4 governments where we actually send people in to train capabilities for tax inspection. Now, everybody says you're crazy because is that in your interest? Sure, it is in our interest. If the countries cannot collect a minimum level of tax, the systems won't function. Now, there might be some companies that do everything possible to escape the tax. I think it's better to work with the people that actually think you need a minimum to have that. So whilst we can point out all these failures in the system, it is time that we have identified or analyzed these issues, that we channel the energy into these solutions. And I clearly live more in that space of solutions than probably is realized or comes out of your book. Hence my suggestion, write a follow-up to get people into that movement for change.
Everybody likes that
You
follow-up.
might, yeah, but you know,
It would sell like only 500 copies to all the Fortune 500 CEOs.
As the only
Well, you
person
know.
on the stage who I think actually took a maternity leave, I would like to add that I appreciate that I worked for employers, have always worked for employers who would have provided that kind of a
Absolutely.
benefit. It's really important. But I'm also conscious, always conscious of the fact that there are so many women right here in my own country who are not guaranteed what I was given, and it is a conflict. We're going to move to audience Q&A. I would like to thank you both because you didn't realize it, but in that exchange, you came around to a topic I did really want to get to, which is the one of scale. And you write really beautifully in the book, Anand, about the way that corporate America has reached out to young people who want to change the world by saying, come to us and we'll teach you how to do it at scale. It is really interesting, though. I happened to see Mike Bloomberg yesterday at the Bloomberg Global Forum, and I asked him about that question of scale. And he's obviously a business person and a huge philanthropist. And he said, that philanthropists can offer demonstration projects, but he felt that it was government ultimately that had to come in when it was time to scale.
Absolutely.
So an interesting debate there. Let's take some questions from the audience. I'm going to, if you can speak clearly so the room can hear you, and then I'm going to repeat on the mic for our live stream viewers.
So there's a correlation between violence against women and poverty. One leads to the other, and an increase in poverty also leads to an increased violence against women. So at what point, and given what's happening in the news right now, as we've also been sitting in this room and witnessing this conversation even hit developed countries, what some of your perspectives on how to alleviate this situation, and at one point you realize, can one realize that respecting women and reduce violence against women is also good for business?
So a question on perspectives about the connection between poverty and violence against women.
You want to take one on one, or you want to take 2 or 3 questions? What is the easiest way of doing this?
Let's take one at a time.
To your last point, I want to say one thing about the economic thing. So there's this argument now that you hear all the time, which is empowering women isn't just the right thing to do. It's the business smart thing to do. Right? That was actually a panel at CGI a couple of years ago, which I write about. And you have these reports from consulting firms like empowering women's a $28 trillion opportunity, right? And so you kind of were getting to that with your last discourse. And I think part of my concern with some of what we've been talking about is I actually think something is lost when really important causes need to be framed in the language of self-interest. So I love that maternity leave helps you retain talent, but something is lost when we lose the vocabulary of doing the right things because they're right even if they're painful, right? I want us to do maternity leave even when it's going to literally take 20% out of the profit of certain companies. We still need to do it, right? I don't want the fact that it helps recruit and retain talent to be the reason we do it, because that leads to you getting it and every woman below a certain income not getting it. And so I think, to my mind, I spent the whole morning watching these hearings. And to my mind, although it's a little different from these issues of economics we're talking about, there's no clearer issue than the Me Too movement and everything affiliated around it, to my mind, that says voluntary solutions aren't going to cut it. This is as systemic an issue as one sees. This is as systemic as racial segregation or anything else. And as we see more women come forward, as we see all the ways in which us men didn't understand and see certain experiences, even though the evidence was there all around, as we see the murkier situations that are still very clear to women and not at all obvious to men, that's what a systemic problem looks like. And to me, it's, again, although it's a little different from this economic conversation, it's the kind of thing that can only be solved with deep systemic reform and laws and policies and movements and fixing this problem at the root for everybody through really profound change that will necessarily be sacrificial. And when we confine ourselves to empowering women in ways that are a win-win, that we lose the plot, in my view. And that's true of every issue.
So I agree with that. In most jurisdictions, you see governments that are heavily run by male. I saw the big party conference in China. You don't see many women on there, but the same in Russia, many others. Surprising, because you think those companies. So politics is failing us for full representation. Where there is a better representation, there seems to be more peace as well, and better decisions being taken. That has proven itself to be the case. So more women in politics would certainly be a thing that would help. You see businesses or CEOs at the top. Unfortunately, I'm a bad example of that I'm not a woman, but you don't see a lot of that gender equality. We have just launched this week something after having worked at for a few years, which is called Generation Unlimited. Many people would argue that getting everybody into education is probably the best unlock. 1 in 5, as I mentioned, people don't go to school, mainly girls. In India now, your country, we're working with the government, where the main issue of absenteeism in school has been actually the facilities, hygiene, toilets for women itself, all the things related to that. So we are having a whole movement which is called Clean India, Swachh Bharat, that we're spending a lot of time and effort behind because it's the best thing to do. Now, I could not do it and make more profit in the quarter, but I think for the long-term functioning of society, it's the right thing to do. So it's not because we have to have a win-win in the bottom line in 30 days or 90 days. It's because we want society to function. In countries that don't function, business can't function either. There's a bigger picture out there, which is a moral picture and an economic picture, but the economic picture starts with people. So I would argue that to address these issues of violence and where it is actually better, we need to do two things. We need to work on fragile states because we, for example, now 125 million refugees, 45 million people in slavery, modern day slavery, mostly women and girls again. So we need to work on these issues of fragile states. And again, we're seeing coalitions coming together from all different sides to try to address that, where governments themselves have really failed, to be honest. And we need to move into the education, if you ask me, for two priorities. And this movement that we have now created around the world with, by the way, people with disabilities included, the youth included, it's really a movement of everybody, is trying to address this with Generation Unlimited. So go into that. But again, these are solutions to solve some things that we know are there without just singling out one or another because we are Jesus on earth. You understand what I'm saying?
May I add, Marcela, may I add to what you were, this thing?
Microphone.
Oh, yes, sure. I just wanted to add a little bit that is a story of Unilever. I came to Unilever in 2013. In 2013, 5 months into it, we have an expose in our tea plantation. And the expose was all about violence against women. It was about discrimination, harassment. And, as I step in this, I'm responsible for human rights and in the corporation. So the proposal was to really have a human rights ombudsman to go to the plantation and do a totally independent review. And we did that. And I remember you, Paul, wanted to interview every single woman in the plantation because we wanted to understand what was happening. And the reality as a result of that, Anand, it was an inconvenient truth because we realized that they were centers of power to what you were talking about. It was probably another form of Me Too because at the most basic level, there was abuse with simple operations, sort of some of the things that you said. And we really address those issues, have no economic, bottom line issue. But we address of that, but we didn't want to stop that. Actually, we wanted to flip it. We said, let us, rather than resolve a problem, let us promote a good, safety for women and girls. And we start working, with the police that didn't recognize those issues, with the women who were antagonistic about the victims, with the hospitals. We identified that. And you know what you were saying before, the first reaction when we tackled this, that you, Paul, says that's not good enough for us, and all the men involved on that. The first reaction that we have coming from the local community was, well, what can you do? It's too hard, it's cultural, it's embedded, what can you do? And we said, no, you need to start someplace. And right now, we are doing in Assam, in your country, together with UN Women, we are doing that model and trying to really tackle the issues and engage everybody in sort of, it is a collaboration, but it's also a movement. And it was anchored, what we did is exactly what you were proposing. We said, rather than proposing the solutions, why don't we ask the women, what would it make them feel safe? So I want to share that with you because I was very proud of that work and the work that we did. There was no bottom line. The only bottom line there was to really have a change in the culture in the community. And
It was the moment we made half of the supervisors women. And we just said, otherwise we just don't have the tea plantation. But unfortunately, in the whole world, these tea plantations are actually the biggest challenge of challenges. So now again, we've put coalitions together of companies like Tata or others to say, what are these standards in the tea plantations? Because there are these competitive pressures that he doesn't like, but they're the reality of the world. So how do you get out of pesticides? How you can treat people better? How do you give them living wages? How you bring sanitation and health to these plantations? Would be a great example of where you have to drive solutions, where often governments don't, because you work in context where governments don't have minimum wages, where people are expendable for some reason I would never understand. And this is where I think coalitions again come in. We're building a new tea plantation in Rwanda. I would never build that alone as Unilever because it's not for us to have all these answers on the societal issues that need to be solved. But putting government development agencies, high net worth individuals, government of Rwanda, human rights people, because the land and all these things happen, putting them all together, you create livelihoods for 100,000 people and you lift a country or a region out of poverty. But you could never do that alone anymore. We're beyond that. If a company just goes in there and how can I get the cheapest tea and make the most money, it's not anymore a sustainable model. So how do you drive those standards to get to the solutions that Anand is rightfully raising in his book is the most important thing for me.
My question is for Anand. I would love to hear you address Paul's critique that governments are inefficient and often the worst propagators of human rights violations within your narrative and your worldview. Because I hear a lot of what you're saying, and I personally agree with a lot of it, but I also hear the critique that if governments aren't doing it, then what is wrong with stepping in and becoming a part of the solution?
Yeah, and to be clear, as I said at the beginning, my book is about America, right? And this is a kind of thing you can't generalize because there are some countries that have very high functioning governments where you don't need companies to step in as much, and there are other places that almost have no government, and I think the answer there would be a very different answer, right? But I think even in the United States, which has a pretty, setting aside the quality for a second, it's not Somalia. Like, it has a fairly advanced machinery of state that should be able to solve our biggest shared problems, right? I'm talking about the problems that are almost definitionally too big for individual actors to deal with, like, 100 million people not getting a good enough education, right? And I've become interested in the way in which, when government is less functional in some of those areas, yes, private actors step in, companies or philanthropists having made money in companies. And the critique is sort of what you're suggesting, which is, yeah, well, government's bad right now. I mean, certainly in the Trump era, you can say government's bad right now, or government's clearly abdicated its role solving this problem, so yeah, why not step in? And to be clear, I'm not saying never step in. A lot of this is about the how. But I think the argument that I would make is what that analysis often ignores is that those same private actors are often the reason government is ineffective on that problem, right? So we can't, one of the things no one talks about when raising this very good question you've raised is the fact that it was business interests in this country starting in the 70s that fought with extreme aggression an anti-tax movement and a deregulation movement, right? It is affluent interests that have fought to ring-fence public school funding so that it stays within rich communities and is not spread equally the way it is in every European country, right? So then when you say, gosh, so in my view what happened was...
So why do you think it's possible in other countries and not in this country? Because you're more of a specialist on this country. I'm more in a a global
No, but
citizen.
I'll
So
get to the
why,
second, but I just
why
wanna-
do you get in that?
Well, I think there's an undue influence of money in politics here. But I think the problem with the critique of like, well, government's not capable, we got to step in, is like, in many cases, it was business interests and the moneyed interests that made government less capable, that literally starved it of funding. I mean, just look at the map of federal discretionary spending, right? And we know we have the trail of who did that, who lobbied for it, who fought for it, and they succeeded. So then to come along and say, well, that's a shame, the government is incapable. Well, here I am. And by the way, we're going to only do it in ways that I like, so we're going to do charter schools, because that's better for me, instead of equal public schools for all, right? The problem, in my view, is that the moneyed interest defanged government, which allowed social problems to fester, and then stepped in to say, well, we'll solve them, but we're only going to solve them in ways that are win-wins, that don't hurt the powerful. So yeah, I think there are all kinds of issues. There's an emergency like climate change. You can't be a purist. Everybody's going to probably have to do something. But I think even in that act of stepping in, there are ways to bring in private interests that aggrandize them, that give them a lot of power, that allow them to protect their own business interests while they're helping. And there's other ways to structure it where they're welcome to help and welcome to chip in, but the public interest is more in the forefront.
We have time for one more question.
You'd be happy to know that Ben & Jerry is working hard to take money out of American politics. And I have to say I'm all for it. That's how we grew up, and systems tend to work better.
Go in the back.
To follow up on that point, if you're thinking about things,
We'll get you a mic.
thank you. To follow up on that point, and if you're thinking about things as a consumer and where we might want to spend our money, or an employee and where we want to give our time and labor to a company, how do you think about how one can make a decision on where are the appropriate places for business to get involved, given the dueling angels of principle and profit? Right, so you're making the statement that this is not a blanket, business should never have a seat at the table.
Right.
But how do we determine when, yeah, this business or this industry should, and I want to give my patronage to them, or I want to go give my labor to them? How do you think about that?
So there's a couple things there. So first of all, I think embedded in your question is one of the reigning assumptions of our age, that when you see a problem, people have been taught to think about, what can I do? So how can I buy differently, or how can I work differently? And I'm stealing this line from someone else. I was at the Brooklyn Book Festival the other day, and someone asked a question like yours, and someone else on the panel, I forget which one it was, said, well, the problem is we need to ask a different question, which is, what can we do, right? Which is not a semantic difference. That goes to your point about movements. The way you ask the question sets you up as the actor, whereas I think if you look at a lot of historic change, really good change that advanced the society in a serious way, it was movements, it was being part of things, it was joining. And it was not tweeting and liking, that kind of joining, it was like real joining. It was meetings, associations of people. I mean, I often ask people, how many global conferences did you go to in the last year? And how many local community meetings in your neighborhood did you go to? And that ratio is embarrassing to most of us, right? So we're not joiners. In many cases, we're not part of things. So that's one thing I would say. And just on the deeper question of like, how do you, that's the question that I'm getting like 100 messages a day from people with a book out. Like, okay, I work at this Silicon Valley company. I think it's evil and a monopoly that should be broken up into two. However, here's my background. I have a different point of view than a lot of people there. Isn't it better that I'm there? And I think those are complicated. Like, I think Gary Cohen was like a sellout who didn't change Trump by being there, even though he thought he did. I think Jim Mattis is probably like saving civilization, right? Those choices about, like, do you get in there and make it a little better or not, are always complicated. What I would say is a lot of people who go in there with the argument of, okay, I'm going to get in there to make it different, end up not really speaking truth to power very much. So I would say if you're going to make the choice of, I want to go in the belly of the beast, I think the obligation that comes with is, I'm also going to put stuff on the line and be the person at Facebook who says, I don't think we're as ethical a company as we think we are, right? But to go there with the fantasy that you're going to do that and then not is like the worst of both worlds.
We have about 30 seconds.
No, I agree with that. I always hear that, what can I do alone, because I'm just a small one, 7.5 billion people, and I just remind people, try to go to bed at night with a mosquito in the room, and you can see how a small thing can make a big difference. So we can make a big difference. We've seen 2 elections in the US and in the UK that are what they are, but if young people would have come out en masse to vote, the elections would have been different. So participate in the political process is a very important part of making democracies function. And the other thing is, we are about, if we like it or not, we are going to transfer about 30 to 40 trillion dollars of wealth from one generation that might have gotten it the wrong way to the next generation. Please spend it wisely. And fortunately, with the internet and all the other things, there is a lot of things we can do in spending power. And whilst we've talked about the difference between moral force and economic force, these two go together, and nothing better than putting your money where your worth is. And it does change companies. The B Corps, 2,600 B Corps now, which is what brought us together here and why we started, actually are quite successful and are all growing very fast. I like them. There are undoubtedly things that we can point out that need to be improved there, but I like them because at the end of the day, they have a broader social mission. They see their role in society a little bit more responsibly than many other companies. It's a part of literally a movement in a direction of changing corporate America, especially in this country. And not surprisingly, they're actually some of the fastest growing companies. So marrying a business model was beyond an interest of the shareholder, or where I would argue the shareholders' returns are a result of what you do, which is certainly not the way many companies think about it now, is probably the most successful one if you want to be around long term. What we've said in Unilever is, we run this business for all of our stakeholders. We don't run it for our shareholders. I could have been more profitable. I could make more money. My salary would be significantly better. But we are running this for a long, for decades, for centuries is what we think about. And you can only do that if you ultimately are to the benefit of the stakeholders you serve, which is really the people in society that we're talking about. His father was one of the people that built grandfather that helped build Hindustan Lever. The only company, by the way, that was never nationalized in India, when other foreign companies were nationalized, because even the government at that time felt that it was working in the long-term interest of India. The reasons that we've been around so long is that we don't produce for the poor, because then we can make a little bit of money. We produce with the poor to ensure that they are lifted out of poverty. And yet, what we are trying to say is that these business models are probably the only ones that you can have long-term and be successful. And yet we have such a hard time getting more companies on board. So that's why we created coalitions like the B Team, or coalitions that we are doing with the World Business Council, or now with the broader chambers of commerce. Because at the end of the day, if we want to move society, sure, we need everybody. But one thing is for sure, we also need that size, skill, and force of the business community to get there. So putting your energy behind these solutions is the best thing to sit here 20 or 30 years from now and say, we did make a change. And we did change the system in it we operate. And we gave the people that were left behind an opportunity to participate in the economic process. And there we can all make a difference, individually, collectively. And that's what we need to do. And no better time to remind ourselves of that here in the UN, during the UN General Assembly. The UN, after all, was created to generate peace and prosperity for everybody. The UN wasn't created just for politicians to drive around in big cars and get priority and walk around with 20 bodyguards and never talk to any of the citizens who vote for it. The UN wasn't created for big businesses to run around and say, we're going to control and we do this or that. The UN was created for the people we need to serve. And that's what Kofi Annan, who unfortunately passed on a few weeks ago, very well understood. Leave nobody behind. For the first time, when governments don't seem to be able to talk to each other, the US not helping in this equation, for the first time we actually have all the countries of the world that have signed a moral framework, which is a guideline or a roadmap that we can actually have. Thank God we have that. Let's put our energy behind that. Let's create that momentum, which is happening in some of these areas, and make the changes. Climate change, we would not have been even half of where we are with movements of we're still in, with carbon pricing and all the other things I talked about, were it not for society as a whole saying enough is enough. And fortunately, more and more businesses are discovering it as well, because with runaway climate change, you can forget any business model in 20, 30 years' time. So this is where we need to put our energy. Anand has done an outstanding job, and I really will read his book from cover to cover in terms of making us feel very uncomfortable with how the current system works, how the current system certainly isn't working for the people that it's ultimately meant to be for. But I hope that it not stays there, and we call it his next book. He's clearly not yet done with getting the maximum out of his current book, but we hope that we collectively are writing the next book for him in terms of what we need to do to make this an inclusive world, and that's why we're all here. So I
When we
thank you
get
for
that book, I vote we come back here and discuss it again, because this
I
was
certainly
wonderful.
look forward to that.
Thank you so much, both of you.
And I'm still on the left. Give me a hug.
And thank you, Carol.
That was fun.
I really
Thanks, fun.
appreciate
It
it.
was fun.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Paul and Anand, for being here and having the courage to have this conversation. You've all just gotten a taste, right? We in this room, we are the ones with any power to make change and the power to engage in these challenging questions and conversations. So I invite you to walk out of here with that new perspective. Think about and process what you heard today. But before you think about and process what you heard today, we've got condiments for you. So please, on your way out, there will be there's refreshments and some food, time for mingling. But before you leave, we've got some little gift bags and all sorts of condiments with character that the team can help you pick out and take home and enjoy. And we look forward to staying in touch. So thank you again. Bye-bye. Yeah, wasn't it?